Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Capability Corner. This is the podcast where we explore what's happening in healthcare, workforce development, and all things capability building. My name is Zoe Yule. I'm Head of Learning and Capability at AusMed, and we have a very special bonus episode, a conversation that I'm really excited to share with you all today. We're talking about inclusive learning environments and how we can design education, but also I think workplace cultures. This flows, really into that conversation that are safe, equitable, and an education and culture that truly enables everyone to participate, learn, and thrive. So it's a topic right at the heart of building workforce capability because, without inclusion, I think we risk leaving potential untapped and unintentionally limiting who grows, who leads, and who contributes to our healthcare environment and the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So to explore this deeply, I sat down recently with someone whose work and story I admire enormously, and that is Vanessa Cameron, brilliant educator, researcher, and very passionate advocate who brings both professional and lived experience to this conversation. So let's get started. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for having me, Zoe. I'm so excited to be here with you today and have this conversation, and I just appreciate the opportunity. A little bit about myself. I've been a nurse for about 14 years now, and about 12 of those have had some form of engagement with professional development. That has included some time in academia as well as in centralized and decentralized nursing professional development departments within different healthcare organizations. I am in the United States. I'm in Washington State. One additional thing aside from my more structured jobs, that pay my bills, my benefits and all that, I also do a lot of consulting on the side. And this has been related to my lived experience. And so, as I said before, I've been a nurse for about 14 years. The first 10 years or so of that, I was a non-disabled person. I became disabled a little over 4 years ago. I'm now a full-time wheelchair user. And so I had this really instant shift in perspective from, really seeing things, seeing my world, experiencing my world in one way my entire life. And then suddenly I realized how different the world can be depending on your circumstances. And I think that's something that you can't necessarily know or understand or fully appreciate unless you happen to be in a group that experiences discrimination. And I found myself in one of those groups instantaneously. And so that really drove my passion for starting to look at inclusive environments. And of course, my background in nursing and nursing professional development, I realized how many barriers there often are within healthcare spaces and within learning environments and the ability to grow and support people as they continue in their professional journey. And so I have built this consulting and advocacy side of really what I do and what I'm passionate about. And I love that I've created that for myself because often working for organizations, while I love and appreciate the work I'm able to do with them, it's for someone else's plan, their strategy. There's constraints around what and how I get to say things, where when I am representing myself and I'm working for myself, I have more ability to advocate and have the voice that I want to. And so I'm, again, just so appreciative that I'm able to be here with you today and have this opportunity to really talk about these concepts and ideas and my own experiences with it from the perspective of just myself. I get to represent me and my experience and what I've learned along the way, which I really value. So thank you so much for that opportunity. One other thing I want to say is that this is not the first time that I have met or talked with Zoe.
I know, but it's a bit different today.
It's a little different today, but I feel so fortunate that we've really known each other, the last 5-ish years.
I'd say 5 or 10, even
Probably
even
beyond
more.
that. Yeah.
We have this really beautiful professional connection, which I think I'll give a little bit of background to our Australian listeners. You can, of course, hear Vanessa's beautiful accent. I feel really, really privileged because, as you touched on, I've been on the end of your podcast, the Disruptor Diaries podcast. And do you want to just give our listeners a little teaser about that amazing initiative that you've got currently?
Absolutely. So we publish our podcast on the last Wednesday of every month. And our podcast is called the Disruptor Diaries, Healthcare, Education, and Innovation Unleashed. And what we're really trying to do is to give a voice to well-known as well as some up-and-coming individuals within the healthcare education space that are really doing things that promote inclusivity and push the boundaries a little bit. It's a part of an NPD collaborative that I'm a part of, and there are 5 of us in that group, and we take turns co-hosting different episodes and different guests. And it's again, such a privilege to be a part of that and to hear stories from people that maybe don't have as much of a voice or a platform yet, and helping them gain that, as well as people that are seen as kind of the superstars of the professional development world in healthcare. Push the boundaries a little bit and encourage people to think outside the box and to think about education differently has been a really great privilege and something I'm really proud of.
For those that in Australia that haven't heard of NPD, nursing professional development, and it's been something that I've connected with an amazing bunch of colleagues in the US over the past 10 or 15 years of my non-clinical nursing career. And we'll get stuck into that today because it really talks to what are the educational best practices that sit behind or with the planning, implementation, and evaluation of education. It's been a really fundamental part of my career and my identity, really moving away from intensive care and finding this whole other world of nursing and education that isn't me going out and teaching nurses or providing training to the workforce, but sitting behind that and helping design and create those learning experiences. And inclusivity is absolutely now recognized at the heart of that. So let's jump in, Vanessa. What do we mean by inclusive learning, and how does that fit into the work that you're doing?
That's a really great question. And inclusive learning is something that doesn't necessarily have a singular agreed upon definition yet.
You're working on it though.
Working on it. But at the end of the day, it really means that you are ensuring equitable access to information so that no matter how individuals learn or receive that information best or most effectively, whatever needs that they have in order to access that information, that those things are met so that they have the support and the opportunity to learn and get that information in this equitable environment. In practice, one of the things that I always like to talk about is the fact that this requires intentionality. You can accidentally make something inclusive, but that doesn't mean that you impacted the environment the same way as if you thought about it ahead of time and said to yourself, here's the class that I'm going to run or the activity I'm going to put together. How can I think ahead and consider the different learners that I can expect to be in this space and make sure that I am proactively meeting their needs? So inclusive learning is all about that proactivity so that people do not have to ask for things to be different, for accessibility needs, for learning in a different style, right? That you have provided those things proactively for them so that they can just go and partake in the education in the way that fits them best. That's going to help them maximize their learning and really eliminate a lot of the barriers that people have when it comes to disclosing or asking for additional needs or support.
It begins with awareness, but how do we form those intentional practices for something that may not currently be at the forefront of someone's practice working in healthcare? What are some of the ways that we can bring that right to the front of how we're thinking about our programs and our workplaces?
I think there's two different things here. The first is going to be to expand your perspective on who your audience is. So often we tend to think of our audience as the majority group, whatever that looks like in your geographic area, right? It's the people that are most often accessing your education. Oftentimes, we build education to suit the masses, right? To suit that majority group. But we need to be really intentional about who else can be there, who else should be there, and how do we make our education so that it is supportive of those people just as much as the majority group. The other thing that I think is really critical here is recognizing the different aspects that go into creating an inclusive learning environment. I really think about it from two different perspectives. One is going to be through the educational design, and the other is through the educational delivery. And so that means that inclusivity needs to be at the forefront of your mind from the very instant that you begin planning your education. You know, things like, who is my audience? Who are my learners? How do I make sure that they are effectively engaged throughout all of this? And how do I broaden who that audience might be so I make this as applicable as possible to as many people as possible? One of the other things you need to consider is your environment. So whether this is a virtual space, maybe it's something asynchronous, like a podcast, like an online learning module that people can access whenever. Maybe it's an in-person event or a live streamed event, but recognizing what are the specific components of the environment that need to be addressed, again, to make sure that as many people as possible are intentionally included and being invited into that space to learn.
Inclusivity isn't a box that we tick at the end and say, all right, let's just go back and audit and assess, like, have we ticked those boxes? It's really grounded in the educational theory. It is best practice, and it's something that occurs concurrently. It's in the process of designing any program and developing any program. What has helped, move best practice from being, recognized and put into practice are standards, guidelines, accreditation frameworks within this world. Is there anything that can help get us where you're saying, to actually recognize and apply these best practices?
That's a great question. And there isn't anything that is currently available. And that was something that actually really drew me to this space, and recognizing as I was looking for best practices, I couldn't go and find a reference or a resource and say, here's how I do this. There's bits and pieces scattered throughout really a wide interprofessional literature base. From K through 12 education to nursing and medicine to psychology. It's really all across the board, and there's bits and pieces everywhere. And in recognizing that, I've actually paired up with a couple colleagues of mine and a large group of peer reviewers. And I'm excited to be able to share here that we'll actually be self-publishing an inclusive learning guide later this year that pulls together all of those best practices across different areas of the literature and applies an adult learning principle lens to them, and also includes a lot of our expertise and personal experiences and best practices for how to approach some of these things that really don't have a lot of literature support.
We would only be looking at it through one lens if we were just looking at what's currently available in the evidence and on paper. But to bring in the lived experience into this guide, these set of standards, that's a phenomenal addition and so important.
Yeah, we are really excited about it. And I think one of the things that was critical for us is we wanted to make sure that whatever we produced in whatever format would be really usable, because I think we all own books that sounded good and then they sit on our shelf, never to be opened again. I have plenty that, I bought and they're on the bookshelf next to me, and, I still haven't read plenty of them.
Yeah, I think they now sit at the bottom of the monitor.
Right.
You've got your screen monitor, and you've got a couple of books to prop it up.
And so really making sure that this is something that is easy to reference and actionable, and even having co-authored this, I want a copy that I can refer to because there's so much information in there. So I'm really excited to be able to, hopefully in the next few months, prior to the end of 2025, have that available and fill this huge gap that there is out there right now in healthcare education.
That's fantastic. And congratulations and thank you for the hard work that you have put into that. To drive best practice and to drive change, we need advocates. We need people like yourself that recognize the gap and say, I'm going to fill that. There is a void and I'm going to help narrow or close that gap. We really look forward to seeing that come to life. Our listeners can absolutely hear that your work, your expertise is very thoughtfully grounded in lived experience and paying homage to the 10 or so years of your educator experience and all of the work. You were an emergency nurse educator, is that right? That's about 20 years of experience. 10 years in ED is about 20 years of actual experience. But another part to where your expertise and deeply sits is your lived experience. And I just invite you, are you comfortable in sharing aspects of your experience, whether it's as a learner, an educator, a researcher, or a leader? If you're comfortable sharing how some of those experiences have shaped your view of this topic of inclusive learning.
Absolutely. When I think about my own experience and really my journey through recognizing and valuing and becoming an advocate for inclusivity, it started before I was directly impacted. It was something that I was always an advocate for, but maybe not as intentionally as I could have or should have been, until in the United States with the murdering of George Floyd. And that really opened some avenues to get in and start more intentionally unlearning a lot of things that had been ingrained in me. And through that process, then soon afterwards with COVID happening, Washington State was one of the first areas in the United States where the COVID pandemic really initiated and was identified. And I happen to live in a place that is a bit more rural, and we have a very large migrant population. And working in the emergency department, I was doing a lot of quality support in addition to education and, working out in the environment at the time. And I was recognizing that those who were coming in, who were non-white, it was taking longer for them to be seen. They were not getting treated as quickly or as thoroughly. And that was something where I said, this is, I'm now seeing this evidence firsthand at my hospital, and it's impacting the community that I live in, and it's not okay. And so from there, I would say, became deeply ingrained, and my goal was to be an ally for people that may not have a voice yet, and to make sure that that perspective could be heard and shared, specifically in the hospital system that I was working at, so that we could make changes and we could do better. After that I became disabled. And as I went back to work as a full-time wheelchair user, there's not a whole lot of wheelchair using nurses out there. And I remember going back and, I had amazing leadership, wonderful support coming back to work. And still it was exhausting and so time consuming to understand and have people help me work through what accommodations I might need so that I could make it through the day and do my job. Through that process, I really realized that there is no way to understand microaggressions, and particularly the collective impact that they have, unless you are a person who experiences them daily. Even with all the work that I was doing in the DEI space as an advocate and as an ally, I did not fully appreciate the impact of microaggressions until suddenly every time I left the house, I had people making comments to me. right? And so it really shifted how I thought about not only the learning spaces, but every space that I was in, and how I started to look at things differently and recognize opportunities that before I would have glanced over. I never would have seen some of those built-in injustices until having this experience. And it seems sometimes so strange to talk about my disability in this context, because life as a disabled person is significantly more challenging. It is harder in so many ways, but I cannot possibly imagine my life without the perspective that I've gained from it.
Wow.
And I am so appreciative of that, even though life is harder. I really can't imagine not knowing the things that I know now because of it.
You offer a phenomenal perspective, and I think there's a lot to unpack, of course, in what you say, and my response and my follow-up question will absolutely not do it justice. But there was a couple of key terms that might be new to some of our listeners that I wonder if that are critical in this topic. And one was unlearning, and the other was microaggressions. And I think the two go hand in hand, but unlearning as part of the learning journey around building our expertise around inclusivity is a really interesting concept. What does unlearning look like?
Yeah, so I think of unlearning as looking back on the things that we have never questioned, that have always just been a part of how we go about life, how we see the world. And oftentimes I think that directly relates back to privilege that we have, because so often, right, privilege, it's not saying that someone has a leg up on someone else. It's saying that this particular aspect of you and your identity doesn't make it harder for you. And when something is just not there for you, that barrier doesn't exist, it's really hard to see those, right? It's hard to recognize privilege because of that. And so this unlearning process is really empathizing with people whose stories and experiences you can never personally have, but saying, I now recognize how and why that has impacted you. And I see the role that I played in that, oftentimes unintentionally. And so that unlearning process is just taking that step back, having a wider view, and choosing to move forward with more intention the next time that you're in that similar situation.
Really reinforces the importance of reflective practice. And for anyone working in healthcare, whether you have mandatory requirements for learning, whether you're running a learning program, but to build that into your own practice and coming to work each day, to have those moments where you're not in the job, you're not doing the things you need to do, you're stepping back and reflecting, how's it going? Where are ways that I can learn and grow as a person? And it's not always formal. It's, as you say, it's carving out this space to say, there are things that I'm potentially contributing to that I might not be aware of, but unintentionally not supporting the diverse audience of people that we work with and that are in our care. So I love that concept of unlearning. What about microaggressions? I imagine there's a little bit more literature and set definition around what that is, but would you mind just double clicking a little bit on that as a topic, Vanessa?
Absolutely. So microaggressions it's often common everyday language or things that are said. Frequently it's unintentional, but it is a slight or causes harm to people that are in marginalized or historically underrepresented groups within a space. I'll use some disability specific things here because I don't want to represent other people's experiences. For instance, in the disability world, oftentimes people with disabilities are referred to as being handicapped. Is that something that you've heard. Is that a common term in Australia as well? Yeah. So the term handicapped actually comes from a time in the United States when we had what are referred to now as the ugly laws, where people who had disabilities were really not allowed out in public. And part of that was if you were visibly disabled, you would also not be allowed to work. And so the only way that people could survive would be to go out and try and beg on street corners. And they would do that by having a cap in their hand. And so that is where the term handicapped comes from.
Oh, as in hand in.
Yeah, or
hand in cap.
Cap in hand.
And
they turn that into handicapped. And so knowing the history of that word, now if someone says that I am handicapped, right, that has a very different meaning to me than someone saying that I'm disabled. Disabled is not a negative word. It has negative social connotation. That's something we're trying to change and reclaim a bit. But the term handicapped, it comes from that time we're saying I am a less valuable person. And here's all the list of things that I can't do for myself and that I don't contribute to society, all of that. And so that wrapped up into a word, when someone uses that, even if it's unintentional, it has this little like, I hate it when someone refers to me that way. But it's not just people, right? It's every time that I go out to go to dinner with my family or the coffee shop, or I need to go get groceries, right? All of the signage in the US, still a good majority of it, it's handicapped parking. Here's your handicapped stall. Here's your handicapped bathroom. And so it's everywhere all the time. And yet it has this meaning to me that is incredibly negative. And so that would be a type of microaggression, something that to me feels harmful, even if other people might not understand why.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that example, Vanessa. And interestingly, what I wanted to touch on next is at the heart of that, and it's words, because we know that words really matter. And one of the examples that I noticed recently that I think talks to the structural and systemic challenges that still often go unseen, that may not be fully understood, but certainly have a direct impact on people. It was when I was renewing my nursing registration, like this year, or in the previous registration period, and I was really struck by a question that when you go through, like, have your name and languages and all that basic information, something like, do you have an impairment that detrimentally affects or is likely to detrimentally affect your capacity to practice as a practitioner or as a registered nurse? And I thought, oh my gosh, like that, the way it was worded was really confronting. Like, I'm hoping that this question was, asked to understand a little bit about, nurses in Australia that may have a disability and therefore get some data on what the numbers and what might be needed. But, and that's my optimistic view of it, that may not also be true, but to ask it in that way that assumed, that brought this bias that, one, it's detrimental, and two, it's going to impact your practice and your ability to practice. I'd love to unpack that language with you, what it means, and ask, how does something like that land with you? What does that signal about the system that we still currently operate in?
Yeah, well, first I would say that statement is full of so many assumptions, which you touched on. I would also say that I don't think that asking questions, maybe that particular wordage, but that sentiment is not unique to Australia and to the licensing process. So I think it is widespread, but I can say that if I was answering that question, in the United States, our nursing licenses are state by state. And so each state may have slightly different questions that you may be asked when you renew your license. And the last time I did mine in Washington, I don't remember anything like that. It may have asked if I had a disability, but it was like a yes, no, which feels fine for me. I'm going to be honest about that. this particular question of, do you have an impairment that detrimentally affects your practice? That one is hard to swallow. I don't know how I would answer that and continue to feel like I was a valuable and worthy nurse, because I would have to answer yes, I guess.
It puts a person in a very challenging position because that is a legal process. Like, you're making statutory declarations as you go through this document, but does it detrimentally affect your capacity to practice? No,
Right. Another thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about this particular question is how many people, and by that I mean probably every single nurse out there, in this instance it's about nursing, has something in their life during that year that is going to detrimentally impact their professional practice, right? I remember having a newborn at home and being awake all night and going into the ICU and working all day.
Yeah.
Right? Like, staying awake all night. Did that improve my practice? Probably not. What about the number of times that people show up to work when they are sick because they know that their unit is short-staffed and they don't want to make it worse? Are they going to be performing at their very best during that day? Or even working 12-hour shifts? We know all of the literature that supports the fact more mistakes are made between hours 8 and 12.
Yeah, that's absolutely example that came to mind for me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But all of those things negatively impact practice, but it's not looked at as a negative thing in the profession. It's not discriminated against. Instead, those are just sort of expected and accepted levels of, like, we know we're asking you to do this thing and we know it's not best practice, but
we've always done it.
And the accepted thing, right? It's not, it doesn't seem different. And so that's okay. But now, because disability is having more representation, all of a sudden, like, this is different. And now I am worried about your ability to perform, even though there's no basis for that. There is zero literature out there that supports that people with disabilities, nurses with disabilities, that there's any difference in the level or quality of care that someone receives as long as they receive the appropriate accommodations. And so it's like all of this hype for nothing. If we could just believe people and give them the accommodations that they need, we would have a more representative workforce and better outcomes.
And be able to provide a better experience for the people in our care. I think to close, Vanessa, I want to connect back all this to capability. Our show is called The Capability Corner, and to me, it is obvious. It's at the heart of what we're trying to do in terms of build workforce capability. But is there any literature? Is there any data that supports that creating an inclusive workplace, an inclusive learning environment within that supports, these workforce or organizational metrics like retention or performance, even confidence of learners? Is there any data that links inclusive learning environments or these building inclusive practices into our teams and workforces with positive organizational outcomes?
I would say there is not a clear data link yet, and it's more because of the fact that inclusive learning environments, there isn't enough of a literature base to even do any quantitative research. However, I would say that there is a clear link with inclusive learning environments and people having greater psychological safety within those spaces. And there is data that shows that increased psychological safety can improve learning. It can improve confidence, improve things like retention of staff.
Absolutely.
So then you have, better outcomes. So I think that there is that link there, and it is threaded through. And I think it starts with that inclusive learning space. Unfortunately, I can't say that there's like this study that we can look at that will show you what outcomes can come from inclusive learning, just because there hasn't been enough foundational research done or published on inclusive learning spaces yet.
For any listener, though, that is looking at or trying to actively build some of these inclusive learning practices into their workforce and development. Just because there isn't data that exists doesn't mean it doesn't make a difference. So, create that data, measure it within your organization, identify what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve by incorporating this change or this improvement in your own practice and the way that you're designing learning for your organization, and share it with the world and add to the body of research, which I have a sneaky suspicion is what you're doing currently. Is that, am I right? Did I see something on LinkedIn about some research, some very important research that you're undertaking?
Yeah, so I'm a part of a few different organizations that are actively doing some research, and it is, again, more specific to disability because that's the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion that I have chosen to focus on. I'm currently in my PhD program. I should be finishing with that hopefully in the next few months.
Wow.
So I'm in the final end or phase of my dissertation right now. And all of my research was on the experience of inclusion in the workplace for nurses with disabilities and what that inclusion looks like and feels like, as well as what some of the barriers are. And so I will definitely be publishing that as Fantastic. I finalize my data. But I'm so excited by just what I've already found and evaluated, and the themes that are coming through, I think are really powerful.
To wrap up, I guess any key recommended learning, further resources to support us all to either learn more about inclusive practice and inclusive learning, or to unlearn some of the practices that we might have that you think would be beneficial to our listeners?
When I think about unlearning, I would recommend that people seek out resources, anti-racism or anti-ableism. That's going to have a different perspective, and the way that it is addressed is more from that unlearning and how do I then go forward and make a difference, versus learning about what those topics are. As far as inclusive learning, I would say you can comb the literature reviews and publications that are out there scattered across the internet, or
permission to plug here. Go
right.
on.
Thank you. Keep an eye out this fall for that inclusive learning guide to become available. And it's specific for healthcare education. So it is not specific to nursing, all areas of healthcare education, both pre and post licensure. And we have our peer reviewers are all spread throughout that entire licensure process as well. So we've really created great perspective and something that's really usable.
Absolutely. And I can testify that it is a very, very helpful, practical, and robust guide. I was very grateful for the opportunity to be one of the reviewers, Vanessa, and I can absolutely, share that it is relevant to anyone working in healthcare, not just education, because education is at the heart of creating these practice changes and building awareness. But education isn't just for educators. Education is for all of us working across the system, for our workforce, but also our leaders that play a critical part in supporting initiatives like this, but also supporting us to make the changes at the system level, at the foundational or at the frontline level. So thank you so much, Vanessa. I am so incredibly grateful to have had this time with you today. I appreciate everything that you've shared, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.
Thank you so much for having me, Zoe.